Gautam Kumra, Managing Partner with McKinsey&Company. Gautam, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Hope all is well and things are safe with your colleagues and with your family members.
It's a pleasure to connect with you all, and touch wood, yes, you're all doing fine and everybody's at home.
Gautam, since everyone is using the word reboot and new normal, I'll use the same words. What is your read of the pre-COVID era or the pre-COVID world? Where do you think reboot button has been pressed, and how do you think a new alignment for the business world would move?
Absolutely. So firstly, look, I hope we could call it post-COVID world. I don't think we can quite say that, because I think, as you and I know, I think we are both still very much living through COVID times. And I think the huge uncertainty is we don't know how long this is going to be. As you know, I think India, unfortunately, is scaling, particularly in the virus count. And we're seeing the count in the days to double is still pretty high relative to some of the other economies that can claim to have flattened the curve. So I think, Nikunj, firstly, I think it's too early to talk about post-COVID times. I think we are for quite some time in this phase of transition to what the next normal is going to be. And I think for now it is during COVID times, this, I would put it.
So Gautam, let me divide the world into 2 or 3 large buckets. One, which companies will survive, which companies will revive, and which companies will emerge stronger. Because each crisis, every time the inertia of the world is shaken, things will move away from the equilibrium. Some may get lost out, some may emerge stronger. So what is your understanding of which sectors, companies and businesses which will emerge as stronger and which will be victim of this crisis?
I think if we learn from the previous crisis, and I think even more so now, we will see increasing polarization. And when I say polarization, I mean polarization between better performing and worse performing sectors of the economy, and polarization between the best performers and the worst performers in any one sector. Now, just to give you a historical perspective, if you look at even going into the crisis, you look at over the last decade or two, the Indian corporate sector invested about $1 trillion into the economy, and roughly 85% of that invested capital did not create a fair economic profit. Only about 15% of the total capital that was invested into the Indian corporate sector over these 2 decades created returns in excess of cost of capital. So you already had going in, and by the way, to give you examples, sectors like IT, telecom, actually IT, pharma in particular, and consumer goods, I would say, are the ones that would fit into the category of 15%. And the remaining 85% was a lot of industrial and heavy capital intensive sectors. So already going into the crisis, you had the haves and the have-nots. What's happening now is the gap between the best performing sectors. And if you look at simply market capitalization since the crisis has struck, you would have seen how IT and pharmaceuticals have actually done rather well. And on the other hand, energy, tourism, automotive, and so forth are actually suffering quite badly. And as time goes by, you see the gap is only increasing. The last thing I'd say is, if you look at any one sector, you can literally take any sector, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's automotive, you look at the gap between the top 10% best performing companies on economic profit, and you compare that with the 10% worst performing companies on economic profit in that sector, that gap is actually increasing as time goes by. And that gap is in fact even much bigger. So the degree of polarization now is even bigger than what we had witnessed in the 2008 crisis.
But Gautam, do you think this kind of polarization will continue? I'm simply using Amazon's market cap for reference. $1.5 trillion is the market cap of Amazon. Apple is north of $1 trillion. Google is almost $1 trillion. Microsoft way above $1 trillion. Even in India, Reliance, the gap between Reliance and TCS, the number 1 and the number 2, I think is quite a large gap there now. So my question is that, do you think that this kind of a migration or polarization towards large and mega companies is transitory, or this is a multi-year trend?
Well, firstly, I think this has already been a trend. I think you go back to pre-COVID times, I think we had not seen the emergence of trillion-dollar market cap companies globally until this last decade. So I think that has phenomenon, as you well know, even pre-COVID, a lot of the market cap and the value creation had been on the back of a handful of large tech companies globally, I think, or literally 5 or 6. And same has been true, by the way, in China, as you know. I think it's really been 2 or 3 tech companies that have driven disproportionate share of the overall value creation. So I think that phenomenon, first of all, has been global. It's been tech-driven to quite a large extent, and frankly has been there even pre-COVID. I think what the crisis is going to do, at least for some time, is I think going to further polarize that, and I think it's going to further extenuate a trend that has been in the making for quite some time.
Gautam, investing is all about positioning future capital to really benefit as the future unfolds. How does one go about investing in this market if you're an investor or a corporate, or even for that matter an PE investor, when the world is so uncertain? If you don't know what's happening in the future, how would you position your future capital?
Firstly, I think I'd start by saying, look, if there was no uncertainty, you wouldn't need leaders. Yes, let's think about it, right? If we would all predict exactly how the world is going to be, I think we could have a bunch of managers running companies and there'd be no disproportionate rewards for leadership. So I think leadership is needed and tested only in times like this. Now, having said that, I think when you are dealing with this kind of uncertainty, I think companies have to think about strategy as a portfolio of initiatives. And I see three kinds of things. One is, I think, no regret moves. So, for example, one of my clients has, very high cost base, 50% of the cost base is fixed cost. They won't be able to sustain that when demand is plummeting by 20, 30%. So they have to just take a massive relook at the entire cost base and restructure it. So that's an example of what I call a no regret move. Second is a bold move. For example, one of the airline CEO I was talking to, with obviously no business in airlines virtually, I think he is making a bold move in building a cargo business. Similarly, one of my logistics clients is finding a huge opportunity in building a hyperlocal logistics business. So second is bold moves, looking at where the opportunity is and making a bold move. And when I say a bold move, I mean disproportionately investing your human and financial capital into an area of opportunity. Third is options. For example, one of my pharmaceutical CEOs is thinking of taking a position in a small startup, which he thinks can add to their digital capability. And it's not a lot of money. It's probably a few $1 million of investment, but it gives them the option to learn from that company and potentially hire in some of the talent that this company has on the digital side. So I think when you're dealing with uncertainty, I think companies have to think about strategy as a portfolio of no regrets, bold moves, and options.
So Gautam, how exactly do you think the digital economy will shape up? There is one side need of automation, then there is complete digitization of all the processes. Cloud business is becoming very well. Tatacom is investing in the enterprise business. TCS is investing in a lot of new initiatives. So what I'm trying to understand from you is that the digital economy is a very vast economy, and everything will not be universally benefiting within the digital economy. So why don't you divide the digital economy for us, that where do you think the rate of change could be the highest?
Look, digital, as we all know, is one of the biggest megatrends of our current times. Even pre-COVID, we had published a paper, in fact, last year that asserted that India is the second fastest digitizing country in the world after Indonesia. And we believe that by about 2025, the digital capabilities have the potential to deliver about $1 trillion to India's GDP. Now, if you break that down, Nikunj, I think a chunk of that comes from what I would describe as traditional digital-oriented products and services, be it telecom, be it BPO, be it IT services, be it communication, and so forth. I think that's a piece of it. But I think the other piece, which could be about $300 to $400 billion off that $1 trillion, is the application of digital really to many of our traditional services. So, for example, it's about e-learning platforms. It's about using it's about developing a digital logistics platform. For example, many of my clients are now setting up centralized cockpits to actually monitor the movement of man and material to ensure full supply availability. You could talk about digital services. As you know, today with COVID, when patients can't see doctors and doctors can't be in clinics, we've seen a massive surge in remote services and remote management. Even industrial activities, for example, remote maintenance of plants, I think some of it is going digital. We see many of the service operations, they are in fact, many of them have asserted that even post-corona, they will not come back at work. So to put it all kinds of services, I think have the potential to drive another $1 trillion in India's GDP. If I give you one example, I was talking to a pharmaceutical client of mine. Pharma industry has an EBITDA margin of about 20-21% on average. If you think about end-to-end application of digital technologies could add about 3 to 4 percentage points to their EBITDA margin and potentially a 2 to 3% more to their growth. So it's pretty serious and very, very central to CEO and management agendas.
Right. Gautam, for India, for the first time, at least in my career, we are using words like a demand crunch. India was always this economy where demographics were an advantage, consumption was always strong, the categories kept on shifting, but demand was never a problem. For the first time, we are seeing a downtick in demand. So when do you think all the measures which you're talking about, whether it is on the supply chain, automation or digital, will actually start getting captured in demand?
I think that's well put, Nikunj. Yes, we've had the demand has been under pressure for some time, and that is the big issue. And I think, by the way, what is interesting is when you go into certain sectors, subsectors, you find that in some places it is actually turning into a supply issue. But by and large, I would say macro, I would agree with you. I think demand is the bigger issue. In some subsectors, supply is an issue given where things are. And I think, and frankly, it varies a ton by sector. You look at non-discretionary retail, I think it's going up quite nicely. You look at demand for digital services, everything digital is actually going up nicely. So I think that is one extreme. On the other hand, we all know, I think that in other sectors, I think demand is under serious pressure and the consumer sentiment is changing. But by and large, most people are being extremely cautious in terms of where to spend their money and downgrading that will happen with consumer spending. I think it's a real issue. And I think one of the things that I think we need to think about is how can you put more money in the hands of people to spend? A lot of measures have been taken by the government, but perhaps more can be done and should be done to put more money in the hands of people to spend.
Appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.